A couple of weeks ago, my wife came to me and said, "Hey, I've gained some weight. I'm not liking it, and I think I'm gonna start tracking calories so I know how many calories I can eat, so I can lose that weight again." And I'm like, I almost lost it because I'm like, what? Tracking calories is not gonna work. It's a colossal waste of time. And I realized that there is this misconception out there that if you just eat a few calories less than what you burn, you're going to lose weight. It's simple math, right? And it appears so simple, so straightforward on paper, but it absolutely does not work. So I decided, you know what? Let's record a podcast episode and really dive into the details on why counting calories is never going to work for the purpose of losing weight. Welcome to the Primal Shift Podcast. And so stick with me because this is interesting, and I hope it'll open your eyes in terms of why calorie counting is not going to work. And I'm going to offer some alternatives that are significantly more likely to yield the desired benefits than it is to count calories. And one of the things, there are so many different factors, but one of the most important ones is that your energy balance, the calories you burn versus the calories you consume. Those are the two parts of the equation. Now, the calories that you burn, those are actually two separate numbers. One is the basal metabolic rate. That's the number of calories that you burn just out of the box by just breathing without any activity. So if you were to lie in bed and just breathe slowly and be there for 24 hours, the amount of calories that you burn by doing that, by just living, is your basal metabolic rate. The problem is that nobody knows what their basal metabolic rate is, because you would have to measure it by measuring the amount of oxygen you inhale, the amount of CO2 you exhale by wearing a mask, and that will help you then determine your basal metabolic rate. Well, there are some people who do that, but for most people, the majority of people who want to track calories to lose weight have no idea what their basal metabolic rate is. Instead, what they do is they rely on numbers, based on your age, based on your weight, based on, whatever your smartwatch tells you. The problem is those estimates are not accurate. They might have a margin of error of up to 30%. So if you're trying to consume 20% fewer calories than what you burn, you're within that margin of error. You might be low 20% or you might not be. You might be plus 10%. You just don't know because you don't have an accurate basal metabolic rate. What's even more complicated than your BMR is to measure your active calorie burn. So, when you exercise, when you move, when you, just walking, ordinary house, anything that you do besides lying around quietly and still and not moving, that would trigger the burn of active calories. And again, you don't know what your active calorie burn is. No, none of the numbers that you're getting from your smartwatch, from your Whoop, from your whatever fitness tracker you're wearing is accurate. Tracking activity or active calorie burn is incredibly important, or incredibly difficult, even with the most sensitive and scientifically accurate devices. So now you have an unknown BMR, an unknown active calorie burn, and that combined has a huge margin of error. So in other words, you do not really know how many calories you burn on a given day. Now, the other side of the equation is how many calories you consume. There you might say it's a little bit easier because you can just look at the nutrition label of the foods that you consume and, get an idea of how many calories they have. Well, the problem is, as per FDA regulation, the food labels have a margin of error of 20%. You guessed it. So there is also plus minus 20%. Restaurant meals, if you make that part of your calorie tracking, can be off by 50%. And food databases are not 100% accurate either. Because the problem is, scientists, what they do is they use bomb calorimeters to determine how many calories, how much energy a food has. Well, the problem is the human digestive system is not a bomb calorimeter. It works significantly. It's more complex than that. And so there is also a margin of error, even though one could argue it might be less than the 20%. Let's say it's 10%, but nonetheless, there are margins of error in all factors of that equation. And that in itself tells you already that it's impossible from a just purely math perspective or statistical perspective to say I want to consume 20% fewer calories than what I burn, because you don't know what those numbers is. But it gets even more complicated than that. We need to interrupt this episode for a quick shout out to our sponsor, OneSkin, because let's be honest, nobody wants the skin cells checking out early. It's called cell senescence, when your cells basically start acting old and sluggish. And OneSkin's OS1 peptide is clinically proven to help slow that down. Plus, it's free of those nasty chemicals you'd rather not have hanging around. If you're ready to give your skin some extra love, head over to oneskin.co, that's oneskin.co, and use code MKUMMER for 15% off. Now back to our regular scheduled program before any more cells decide to retire. So here is the thing. 100 calories of bread behaves in the body differently than 100 calories of meat. What I mean by that is, generally speaking, the body uses energy to digest food, and the energy requirements differ depending on the type of foods, specifically on the type of macronutrient. So in other words, the body needs more energy to digest protein. It needs a little bit, or significantly less energy to digest carbs, and it needs even less energy to digest fat. In real numbers, that means 20 to 30% of the calorie of protein calories are burned via thermogenesis, meaning that the digestion itself uses up calories so that only 70 to 80% of the calories from the protein remain available to the body after digestion, whereas 90 to 95% of the carbohydrates remain available for digestion. So if you track, if someone, let's say, burns 2,000 calories a day, and they consume 2,000 calories worth of bread, or 1,900 calories worth of bread to have a caloric deficit, whereas someone else burns 1,900 or consumes 1,900 calories worth of meat, then their energy balance is going to be significantly different, because a few hundred calories are going to be available less for that person who decided to consume meat instead of bread. So that in itself skews your calculations, but none of the apps, none of the trackers that just use the calories, as reported by a food database, take the thermogenetic effect into account. So you're again off by 10 to 30%. More importantly then, going back to the different macroproteins, macronutrients, protein is not only used for energy in the body, it's predominantly used for building muscle tissue and many, many other factors, for making hormones, etc., etc. The same goes with fat. They are used for hormone creation, for cell membrane stability. There are a lot of things that the body uses fats and protein for other than energy. Energy is not the primary source of protein for humans. On the other hand, 100% of the carbohydrates that remain after digestion are available for energy. So that again, if you look at proteins and you say, okay, 30% of the protein is already burned through digestion, from the remaining 70%, 30% is used for something other than energy, then you end up with a fraction of the calories that you would have to put into that equation. None of those calculators do that, and so that in itself is completely misleading. And if you combine then the margin of error from measuring your calorie burn, measuring your calorie intake, plus the thermogenetic effect of the different food types that you're consuming, there is no way of measuring anything. You just, it's random at this point. You just, do whatever you think. So, let's say you aim for a 300 calorie daily deficit. Because if you do that over time, you're going to, lose X number of pounds in a week, in a month, etc. Now your food tracking has a plus minus 20% margin of error. Your activity tracking has a plus minus 30% margin of error. The thermogenetic effect of food introduces another up to 60% margin of error. And so that means you might overeat by 100 calories, or you might significantly undereat if you predominantly consume protein with fat. And so it is impossible, and the funny thing is that even if you're only 100 calories off, so let's say you, because of your poor math or because of the way it works out mathematically, you end up over consuming 100 calories every day. That's very little. I mean, look at how little food you'd have consumed to be just 100 calories over. That's 36,500 extra calories per year. So theoretically, that would equal 10.4 pounds of fat gain by only over consuming 100 calories per day. The bottom line here really is you cannot reliably track calories in any shape or form to use that for weight loss or for weight gain. It is mathematically impossible because you don't have the data to make the math work, and you don't know the complexities, the intricacies of how your specific body, which might be different from person to person, metabolizes and uses nutrients for energy and for any of the other processes in the human body. So it does not work. You cannot track calories for burning or for losing weight or for gaining weight. It just does not work. If it did, if it was that simple, just to give you some anecdotal evidence, I consume, every time I eat, I would argue I overconsume. I eat until I'm full and then some more, and I don't gain weight. How is that possible? If someone else does the same thing, they might look like, a Michelin guy. I don't. How is that possible? Well, because the human body is not a simple machine. It's not about calories in, calories out. It's significantly more complex than that. And the numbers are not accurate. And so what can you do then instead? Because if calorie tracking doesn't work, what can you track? Well, honestly, I'm not a huge fan of tracking, period. But if you want to track something, track your protein intake. Consume as much protein, 1 gram per pound of body weight. If you do that, then there is a good chance that there is very little else you want to consume because you're so full and satiated, because protein, especially when combined with some fat, is incredibly satiating. Eat protein first. Track your protein intake if you feel like you want to track something, and then use fat and carbs as sources of fuel. You always need some fat, but you don't have to get all of your energy from fat. You can certainly eat some carbohydrates, high quality carbohydrates from seasonal fresh fruits, etc. Nothing wrong with it. Raw honey, maybe dairy, raw dairy if you can handle it, whatever. But stick to protein first. Track your protein if you want to. Use fat and carbohydrates strategically as your sources of fuel, but you don't necessarily have to track them. If you want to, just make sure you don't consume too many carbs. Stay under 50 grams or whatever a day, 25 grams if you want to do a low carb ketogenic diet, and you'll be good to go. If you want to, you can use a continuous glucose monitor to see how your body responds to food, because ultimately gaining weight or the inability to lose weight is likely directly linked to your blood sugar and insulin levels. If insulin is high, it's the fat storing hormone, you're not going to lose weight, or it's going to be very, very difficult. So if you use a CGM, even though it doesn't directly report your insulin levels, you can get an idea of how your blood sugar levels are. Because if your blood sugar is chronically elevated, chances are so is your insulin. And if your insulin is high, you're not going to be able to lose weight. And fat in particular. So use a CGM to find out how do you respond to certain types of food. Maybe it'll surprise you that that banana you're having every afternoon, causes a crazy spike in blood sugar, whereas eating an apple does nothing to you, or eating berries does nothing to you. Maybe one slice of sourdough bread that you think is so healthy because it's sourdough and you made it yourself, causes a crazy spike in blood sugar. Like in the case of my wife, that's how we found out that she does absolutely not respond well to sourdough. As healthy and organically and homemade as it is, she does not respond well to sourdough, period. And so you need to find those things out to determine what you can and, more importantly, you cannot eat. Understand your metabolic flexibility. Your body doesn't burn a set number of calories each day. It changes, and if you're a menstruating female, it changes throughout the month, and you need to understand all of those things and take them into account. The other thing is, hormonal differences, especially between men and women. Fasting, training, exposure to hormetic stressors like cold plunging and sauna bathing. Food timing. All of that impacts men and women differently, because men are typically on a 24-hour hormonal cycle, testosterone spiking in the morning, going down in the afternoon. Women are on a 28 to 30 day cycle, significantly different. That one sourdough bread you might have before your period might respond, or you might respond entirely differently to having the same slice of sourdough bread after your period. All of the things you need to take into account. But one thing is for certain: calorie tracking is flawed, inaccurate, unreliable. It does absolutely not work. Focus on nutrient quality, satiety, protein intake, metabolic health for sustainable weight loss, and forget tracking calories. It's a freaking waste of time that leads to nothing but frustration. Maybe sometimes you get lucky, but you don't want to use luck as your underlying strategy for weight loss. With that, we're going to wrap it up. Let me know, have you tried calorie tracking in the past? Has it worked for you? I suspect if it has, then it was probably just luck. But nonetheless, let me know. I'd love to hear. If you watch this video somewhere where there are comments allowed, let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from it. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. I think many people need to hear it, especially in the female community. I feel like everyone is into tracking calories because they want to lose weight. It doesn't work. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. I wish it was. It was so simple on paper. It doesn't work. So until next time.
Next week on the Primal Shift Podcast, we're cracking open the truth about eggs. Are they really nature's perfect food, or could they be wrecking your gut? We raise chickens ourselves, so we've got some hot yolk takes you don't want to miss. Tune in